Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to The World Over Live. I hope you're all having a terrific summer. Thanks for being here. The Vatican recently issued updated norms dealing with sex abuse by clergy, among other things. Here to discuss those new norms, as well as the controversy surrounding their release, is the former chair of the USCCB's National Review Board and former governor of the great state of Oklahoma, Frank Keating. And later, we'll bring you an encore of my conversation with Newt and Callista Gingrich. We talked about their new documentary focused on the life of Pope John Paul II, 9 Days That Changed the World. And we also chatted about Gingrich's conversion to Catholicism. But first, here's the brief news from the world over this week. The Vatican has released its revised set of church guidelines in response to the clerical sex abuse scandal. The bulk of the new guidelines canonically codify existing norms for dealing with and punishing priests who abuse minors, thus making them permanent and binding. Additionally, the statute of limitations for the congregation's handling of alleged priestly abuse was extended. Molestation of the mentally disabled, as well as the possession, distribution of child pornography by clergy, is now also considered a grave crime. The document also adds other exceptionally serious offenses against faith and morals not previously set forth. Among them, the attempted ordination of a woman. Pope Benedict XVI approved the revised norms back in May. More details about this document and what it means at the diocesan level around the world in our next segment. On Tuesday, the Senate Judiciary Committee approved Elena Kagan's nomination for U.S. Supreme Court Justice. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham was the only Republican to join the Democrats in a 13-6 vote. Republican Senators Orrin Hatch of Utah and Jeff Sessions of Alabama both expressed concern that Kagan's deeply held liberal progressive political views would translate to political activism on the high court bench. Expected on the court docket in the coming years are constitutional questions concerning abortion, marriage, gay rights, and the recently passed health care overhaul. The full Senate will vote on her nomination in the coming weeks. With overwhelming support from its Democratic members, confirmation is expected. And this past week, Planned Parenthood of America announced that Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, will be honored with its Champions of Women's Health Award for her efforts to support women and their reproductive health. In a statement, Planned Parenthood praised Pelosi, a Roman Catholic, for her instrumental work on the recently passed health care overhaul, which permits abortion funding. Specifically, they lauded Pelosi for having led her female colleagues in Congress as they stood strong against attempts to insert the Stupak abortion ban, end quote. Also receiving the Planned Parenthood Award is Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan and Connecticut Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who is also Roman Catholic. And more Christian persecution abroad. 2 Pakistani Christians acquitted Monday of blasphemy charges were murdered as they left the courthouse. Rashid and Saeed Emanuel had been arrested earlier this month after distributing pamphlets purportedly critical of the Prophet Muhammad. Following the murders of the brothers, grief-stricken and angered Christians took to the streets in protest. According to the Vicar General of the Diocese of Faisalabad, some Muslim shops were vandalized. A mob of 2,000 Muslims retaliated as shops in the Christian district of town were torched and looted. Bishop Joseph Coutts of Faisalabad has called for calm. And the Sunday Telegraph is reporting that the UK's coalition government has made their choice for ambassador to the Holy See. Catholic convert, novelist, and former Conservative Member of Parliament Anne Widdecombe will get the nod pending final approval from the Vatican. The Tory stalwart is also an outspoken defender of the faith. In a recent interview, she expressed concern at growing intolerance to Christianity and was critical of Britain's new equity laws, which forced Catholic adoption agencies to either shutter their doors or offer services to homosexual couples. Widdecombe converted to Catholicism in 1993 after the Church of England voted to ordain women priests. A Catholic ambassador to the Holy See is still a bit of a novelty in Britain. Widdecombe would be only the second Catholic to serve in the post, the first being the current ambassador, Francis Campbell, appointed in 2006. And the Holy Father has chosen a new Vatican ambassador to the United Nations. Indian Archbishop Francis Kulikat is the new permanent observer of the Holy See to the UN. The appointment is one of the Holy See's most important diplomatic posts. It came less than 3 weeks after the transfer of the previous ambassador, Archbishop Celestino Migliori. Archbishop Kulikat is well-traveled. He served as the Vatican diplomatic corps, or in the diplomatic corps in Honduras, South Africa, the Philippines, as well as an earlier 3-year stint at the UN. In 2006, he was appointed the Apostolic Nuncio to Jordan and Iraq. And finally tonight, every now and again, Catholics may sweat it out in the confessional, but a Catholic priest in Vienna probably went a little too far when he put an actual church confessional up for auction on eBay and advertised it as a convertible one-person sauna. I'm not making this up. Apparently, the auction was merely part of a parish fundraiser. Besides the sauna, the priest suggested that the confessional could also be converted into a small bar or perhaps a children's playhouse. The Archdiocese pulled the auction down after one bidder offered 666 euros for it. And in case it wasn't obvious, the Archdiocese noted that auctioning objects that were used for dispensing the sacraments is not acceptable, and confessionals, quote, should not be converted into saunas or bars. Glad we cleared that up. Before the break, we want to remind you that starting in September, the world over will be premiering Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. So adjust your schedules and your DVRs, and please join us live on Thursdays starting in September. Up next, Governor Frank Keating and canonist Father Philip Brown joins me to talk about the Vatican's updated norms regarding the handling of clerical sex abuse cases. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. My first guest is an attorney, a former FBI agent, and the former governor of his native Oklahoma. In June of 2002, he was named chair of the advisory panel to the U.S. Bishops' National Review Board for the Protection of Children and Young People. Given his perspective, we thought him ideal to weigh in on the updated norms announced by the Vatican dealing with sex abuse crisis, or the sex abuse cases, rather. He is currently the president and CEO of the American Council of Life Insurers. Governor Frank Keating, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us to give us a canonical perspective is Father Philip Brown. He's a professor of canon law at the Catholic University of America. Father, thanks for being with us again.
Good to see you again.
Let's launch right in. First, I want to ask you, Governor Keating, you had a rather stormy tenure in 2002 when you headed up this National Review Board. What were the why did you resign from that position?
Well,
was it for being too blunt?
Well, perhaps. But I think that what's important is I came in a committed Catholic layperson to do what I could as a result of the request of the bishops to address the issue of clerical sexual abuse with minors. When I left, obviously, I had some disappointing moments, but I am as strong an Orthodox Catholic, more so, quite truthfully, today than I was even when I became the chairman of this board. The truth is the bishops, the Conference of Catholic Bishops in the United States, did a very significant thing, I think a wonderfully soul-searching and resolving thing in saying that they wanted us as a board, and I didn't choose the board.
Right.
I was chosen to chair it, and the bishops chose the other members. Number one, transparency. Any settlement of a case involving clerical sexual abuse would be exposed to the public. Money in terms of settlement, legal fees, and the like, the lay community would know what those figures are. Number two, zero tolerance. one strike and you're out. If an individual molests, assaults a young person, that person should no longer be in ministry. And number three, in my judgment, certainly as significant as any of the other two, criminal referral. That is, referral to the civil authorities. An allegation of sexual misconduct, don't investigate it yourself. Send it to the cops. Let the cops decide. If they resolve it in your favor, then a return. If they resolve it, on the other hand, in a criminal prosecution, then you step back and try not to be defensive or an apologist.
At the time, you felt some bishops, and I say some, were not cooperative, were not forthcoming, would not even let you all see their records. And you compared them to La Cosa Nostra.
Well, my point about La Cosa Nostra was there was a desire for secrecy by some, and I said at the time, and I would say it today, that we are not a criminal organization, we are a church, we're a faith community. There should be total humility and total transparency. But give it to the bishops. I mean, you have a huge number of people. There are A students and B students and D students. They're all types and sizes. But they are the ones that chose the board. They are the ones that gave us our mandate, and they went along with my suggestion that the Catholic Review Board create this Office of Child and Youth Protection and put a cop in charge. I felt it was very important as a message to the lay community that we have a cop, and we hired a former assistant director of the FBI who happened to be the highest-ranked woman ever in federal law enforcement, and I think she did a wonderful job.
I want to move on to these new norms. Father Brown, what are your general thoughts? Now, these norms touch everything from sex abuse to crimes against the sacraments to other offenses here, grave offenses. What is your general takeaway of these new norms?
Well, Raymond, when it comes to the investigation and ascertainment of whether or not someone has assaulted or sexually abused another person or committed another crime, when it comes to the investigation and making of that determination, the devil is in the details. And so procedural norms are norms that are developed based upon the experience of the legal or the canonical community of the missteps that are often taken in the investigation and prosecution of a criminal accusation. And so when you, as Governor Keating said, there should be zero tolerance if someone has assaulted or abused a young person. But that's the big if. The if is the big question. How do you get from the if to the sufficient certainty that then you can penalize that person or punish them for the act? So the norms are established. Procedural norms are always established in order to protect people's rights, not to be falsely accused or penalized for something until you have arrived at that level of sufficient certainty to impose a penalty. And so that's where the details are that become problematical. And whenever you are in a crisis mentality, the first impulse is always to loosen the rigor of procedural protection. So you have things like, I mean, there's an example really that's very current right now. You had the situation that's being reported today where a government employee was pressured to resign without ever having apparently had an opportunity to give her side of the story. That's basically what procedural norms protect, is the person's ability to give their side of the story and protect themselves. And that's the concern.
If I may, postscript what Father said, because I agree with him. The proposal that was made by the Vatican for all of us to absorb and accept was to increase the statute of limitations another 10 years.
So 20 years after the 18th birthday.
Right, so roughly nearly 40 years of age, 38. Well, maybe that's good, that it will sweep up other allegations and accusations, but I'm not so sure, and I've been a United States attorney in my state, been an FBI agent, supervised all the criminal prosecutions in the United States years ago at the Justice Department. What concerns me is due process. If you accuse someone of a criminal event, if that person is a criminal, you want them obviously to be locked up and removed from society, but you want to make sure that the facts prove beyond a reasonable doubt the accusation. And in the case here, and we're not talking about the civil system in our society, but to suggest that I can't get any witnesses to protect me from a false accusation because this is 30 years ago this thing occurred. I'm not sure that's healthy.
Yeah.
And in the United States, I would hope we would not do so.
And that's a really good point, because in 2003, John Paul II took to the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the ability to laicize priests without a trial. Yes?
Yes. And that's repeated. That's repeated.
And that's
in the new
repeated
norms.
here. And this is consistent with the sort of zero tolerance. But we have seen in the ensuing years, and I think I'd like to get your thoughts on this, both of you. I know myself a number of priests who have been accused in those intervening years of various offenses. This thing goes to trial. They're knocked immediately out of ministry. And 4 years later, it is determined these are baseless allegations, and the poor man's reputation has been damaged irreparably in some cases. Is there some due process or protections that you see, Father, in these new norms, and should there be, Governor Keating?
Well, I would like to point out that there is in effect, there's the promise of protection in the new norms, because the norms, even when there's a dismissal under emergency circumstances directed by the Pope, the norms always reinforce by saying, provided that the accused person's right of defense has been protected. From a canonical standpoint, here's the conundrum that I faced. In fact, the Canon Law Society published a study on due process and the right of defense in their 70th convention proceedings, that for someone of a legal mentality, the problem is that a judicial proceeding is what defines due process in the American sense when there's a criminal accusation. That's what due process means. In the canonical system, I always like to point out, we tend to use the term due process and right of defense as equivalent terms. They're not. The right of defense is from a whole different legal system. It's a natural law concept, whereas due process is what's created and protected by the U.S. Constitution. And so when the norms say, provided the priest's due process rights are protected, many canonists would say, but if you eliminate the possibility of a trial or the actuality of a trial,
they can't defend themselves.
How have you protected their due process rights? Because you have eliminated some of the elements of the right of defense, perhaps. So that's not necessarily as that done, but the question a canonist poses says, then when you say you're going to allow someone to be dismissed administratively, but their due process rights are going to be, or their right of defense is going to be protected, then you have to be more specific. How in the administrative process, then, is the right of defense protected?
And that isn't made manifest
That's
here.
what we don't necessarily
Well, in the criminal system in the United States, federal or state, there are statutes of limitations. That doesn't mean we want the guilty to go free. Murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. Obviously, if you have DNA evidence, if you have witnesses, they can be brought in. But in the federal system, it's 5 years. In many states, it's 3 years. Why is that? To make sure that the evidence is fresh and the witnesses' memories are accurate and you can cross-examine your accuser. In these cases, I mean, was a cop. All of us as a board were very aggressive. Whoever did this, whoever would molest young people, in most cases, by the way, there were homosexual assaults, very little pedophilia, but whoever would do this were criminals. These people should be in jail. But we all said, consistent with their right to defend themselves, there are false accusations. Some child got an F when he should have gotten, or got let's say a D when he thought he should have an A or whatever. You know, there are accusations that are made. You want to make sure always, whether it's the canon law system,
well, I'm worried that this
or
is
our criminal system, is that, you know, people who are accused are fairly tried.
Right, and I'm worried that we have now, that we've gone from, as you said, sexual assaults, many times homosexual in nature, at least the cases you all were examining in the past. Now we're having cases where a woman comes forward and says, Father, you know, touched me inappropriately, looked at me inappropriately. This guy's immediately out of the priesthood. He's moved out, he's on administrative leave. So he can't really minister as a priest. Sent to some facility. This has become almost knee-jerk. And I worry, has this created a climate where the priest doesn't have a voice to defend himself until much further down the line?
That's the reason we were adamant as a board that there be first criminal referral, because that provides you safety and separation. Now, maybe there are systems in the world where criminal referral is a star chamber. But in the United States, to refer that case, to have the police examine, let's say the case of that woman making her allegation.
Report to the civil authorities. Let them investigate.
Right, and then they'll say there's no evidence of this, and you don't have a problem.
And this document doesn't necessarily say that. Now, there was an April document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith that did encourage bishops to turn these cases over to civil authorities. Father, they're not in this new norm, though.
No. The press conference information that was given reiterated the April statement and said that that's taken for granted in the issuance of these norms. As a canonist, frankly, I view it as a canon lawyer. We have our own processes in the church. If they function properly, I have confidence in them. And so I wouldn't necessarily say the solution to this is just turn everything over to the civil authorities. If something is a civil crime, it should be reported to the civil authorities because that's when they're in their jurisdiction. But I don't think that should relieve the church of its responsibility in imposing ecclesial penalties and consequences to follow its own processes.
Let's move through some of these other points. The use and distribution of child porn by someone in the clerical state is considered sexual abuse of minors now as a result of this document. Sexual abuse of mentally ill persons, regardless of age, is considered the equivalent of abuse of minors. And particularly serious crimes are sent directly to the Pope. Now, why do that? Why provide that in this document, Father? Where particular grave offenses are sent directly to the Pope?
Well, I think that what the norms are trying to capture
to decide whether to dismiss someone from the priesthood
is a concern that they have perhaps in watching the degree of procedural protections in civil law systems is what do you do in a truly emergency situation where by following strict norms to the T, you're in fact giving an advantage to someone who needs to be taken off the street, so to speak, or taken out of ministry because their conduct is so obvious and so egregious. So I think, in general, canon law tries to build in an exception clause that says, but you always have to allow the highest authority the effort to move expeditiously when it's necessary. So I think that's what that's trying to do.
Governor Keating, there's another area of this that deals with the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which overlooks, ensures orthodoxy and that the faith is being taught properly and dispersed around the world. They are saying that they now have competency over judging everyone from a cardinal to a bishop to a priest in these areas. There is something, it's very clear here, and the press really had a bonanza with this. They were claiming that this new norm puts the ordination of women or the attempted ordination of women on a par with sexual abuse of minors because it says, it provides in these norms, a bishop who tries to ordain a woman is immediately excommunicated. There is no provision dealing with a bishop who might be guilty of sexual abuse of minors or reassigns a priest after knowing that he's guilty of the sexual abuse of minors. Is that a flaw in this norm or an inconsistency?
When I was first asked by then Bishop Gregory, who's now Archbishop of Atlanta, he was East St. Louis bishop, to be chairman of the Catholic Review Board, my initial reaction was this was all anti-Catholic bias. I mean, my reaction as a lay Catholic of a very Protestant family, my mother was a convert, my wife was a convert, as I mentioned, my 4 grandparents, 3 of 4 were not Catholics. You know, I was convinced it was anti-Catholic bias. I got into it and discovered it wasn't. So let's clean it up and move on to the next order of business. I think the press has a field day with things like this. And I think to mix in issues that are not child and youth protection issues confuses people who are not Catholics. And they use this as an opportunity to suggest, you mean the destruction of a young boy by an aggressive, assaulting criminal priest that resulted, as we had in one case when we had the parents of this young man talk to us as a board, he committed suicide. I mean, think of the tragedy of that and to mix that in with the ordination of a woman in the same breath as if this is the same grave error. obviously, from a ecclesiastical standpoint, canon law standpoint, maybe they're all equal. I don't know. But to present it to a secular country that goes to church,
it's
like
a
the United
PR
States,
misstep.
it's a PR misstep. That's correct.
Father?
I view it purely as a PR misstep. It's unfortunate that they included in this document rather than issuing a separate norm for that, because the fact that it is unlawful for a bishop to ordain a woman has been very strongly established in canon law. But to put it together just opened to the door to this kind of mixing up of things. And so I think that was probably a misstep. But the question for them
But in the eyes of the church, they're looking at this as a matter of faith. This is a spiritual approach. They're worrying about protecting the sacraments in general, yes? I mean, that's what these norms seek to do.
And that's why they lumped them together,
Right.
because they said, well, this is a document about how we proceed in delicts against the sacraments, and this is a delict against the sacraments.
Right.
And so to put them on a par is not the same thing. And when it comes to restricting investigations against hierarchs to hierarchs, the interesting feature of that is, the principle of being entitled to a jury by your peers that grew up in American law meant if you were a lord, you were allowed to be tried only by lords, not by low persons, etc. And so that mentality kind of still exists there. Well, who judges a cardinal when their office sort of puts them in a higher office? But they don't have the same notion in that legal system that we have in America that's kind of leveling and says everybody stands equally before a court of justice. I don't know how to resolve that. I would like to point out one other thing, though. When they mention this ordination of women, they don't mention something else in this document that I think is very significant, that really has a similar that kind of effect, and that is that the new norms allow non-clerics to be judges in judicial trials. Prior to this time, a woman could not sit as a judge in a trial against a priest. Now that's possible, and there are many fine women canonists out there that should be made use of in these cases, in many cases, because they bring a very important perspective.
And the one thing that I think Father would agree with, all of this speaks to a universal church. Hundreds of countries, hundreds of languages. So I know when we first got involved in the sexual abuse scandal in the United States, the reaction initially from our friends, fellow Catholics abroad was, well, these are those oversexed Americans. I mean, they all do dumb things.
The English problem.
That's right, the English problem. But obviously, it is a universal problem. It's a human problem. And I understand that all of these things have to be divined and decided and presented in a universal way. But from a public relations standpoint, when you have the agony of this abuse, the focus should have been, in terms of public presentation, the agony of this abuse, and in effect saying that, the Lone Ranger's on his way. And that simply was not the way it was handled. It doesn't alter the fact that substantively there's some good there.
It's here,
But, what we're doing in the United States and have done to make sure this doesn't occur again is important that it continue.
And there's also some fascinating new norms here that are keeping up with the times and the ever-changing abuses against the sacraments. For instance, violations against the sacrament of penance, violating the seal of confession using recording devices or modern technology, or attempting to give absolution when one is not disposed to do so. There are penalties attached to this. So it is the church, I think, struggling to gather in and account for things that 100, 200 years ago were simply not issues before it. Yes?
Well, yes, absolutely. And we have been through a truly agonizing experience in the last 10 years in the United States. But given what we've seen now as scandals have grown up on the other side of the ocean, I really think as Catholics in the United States, we should take pride in the way that our bishops and the lay review board and people like Governor Keating took the bull by the horns and struggled with all of the complexity of this and said, we're going to make the situation better. And now we've led in that progress.
But I remember when I went to London while I was chairman, and a group wanted to meet with me that said that they represented a similar board, and it was their board in London. They were Anglicans. And I said, the first reaction was, well, the problem is a celibate clergy. These folks said, oh, no, our problem is serious within the Anglican community. What are you doing in the United States? How do you address the issue? Not only assaults on boys, but girls, as we have in the United States as well. I said, well, unfortunately, we have a sinful tragedy that you know,
defies borders.
You may be in the clergy, but you do bad things. Some do on very rare occasions. So that stunned me. But it is a universal problem.
I was in England all last week and met people from Ireland and in England just grappling with the first brushes of this. What we looked dead in the eye 10 years ago. What would be your advice, Governor, to the lay people and the bishops? Now you have a group of cardinals, some from the United States, who are going over to investigate the Irish situation. Your advice to them as they undertake that journey and as the English and Irish church contend, Belgium church, I mean, it's all over the world, German church.
I mean, certainly there are legal systems that differ from continent to continent. In Ireland, for example, or in the UK, they are solid systems that we borrowed many of our standards from them. The three hallmarks of our board's instructions from the bishops: transparency, tell everybody what you're spending to get out of this; zero tolerance, we're not going to have 2 strikes or 3 strikes at bat, provided due process is followed; and third, criminal referral. These individuals who are accused of this are committing crimes against the state. Refer these matters, don't hide them or cover them up, refer them to state authorities. And you'd give, I think, the Catholic lay community comfort to know that their children are protected. And ultimately, you want to hold the church together and families together by doing exactly that.
Very good. Father Brown, Governor Keating, thank you for being here. We could go on for the whole hour. Thanks to both of you. When we return, Newt and Callista Gingrich speak about their latest film on the life of Pope John Paul II and Newt's recent conversion to Catholicism. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there. Thank you.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. My first guest is a veteran politician here in Washington, D.C. He was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Georgia in 1978 and soon rose to prominence as a congressman, eventually becoming Speaker of the House in 1995. Since his retirement, or departure rather, from the House in 1999, he's done anything but fade into the background. Newt Gingrich is kept busy as a political commentator, a consultant, as well as a film producer, with his wife and partner, Callista. They joined me in studio recently to talk about their latest project, 9 Days That Changed the World, a film about Pope John Paul II's 1979 visit to Poland that dramatically transformed the political landscape of the 20th century. Newt also spoke at length about his conversion to Catholicism last year. Here's the interview. So I want to start with the film, 9 Days That Changed the World. It's this incredible, wide-ranging documentary that looks not only at the life of John Paul II, but focuses on that 9-day visit to his homeland in 1979 that really did change the world. What was the motivation here?
In 2008, we went to Europe to tape a documentary on President Ronald Reagan. And at that time, we visited with President Lech Wałęsa in Gdansk and President Václav Havel in Prague. And we'd asked about the Holy Father and his influence on undermining communism. And both of them agreed that his trip in 1979 was critical to liberating Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. You know, as I watched this documentary, I was struck by the speeches themselves. When John Paul is out there in the squares and when he's driving with the Pope Mobile through the crowds, you rarely, I've never seen footage where you could actually hear him. I've always seen the wide shots and the expansive things. How did you come across the footage and how long did that take?
Well, it took us a good while because it turned out that the bishops had really given out cameras. They didn't trust the communists.
Oh,
and so the bishops got a bunch of cameras, and they had lots of people filming. And it turned out that all of this archive was available. It's actually now, in the post-communist era, at Polish national television. And our field producer, Vince Haley, went over and spent weeks with the archivist.
You can tell.
Just going through, mile after mile of film, finding these nuggets that have never been seen before in this kind of setting.
No, I'd never seen it. And as I was telling you before we started, the reactions of the people and the shots of the solidarity banners, I thought, clearly this was not authorized by the regime at the time. Right. So how did they get this footage? So I'm glad you explained that. Now, you, Newt, have said that there is a correlation between what happened then and what was going on in 1979 in Poland and our contemporary situation here in the United States. How are they related?
Well, I remind people first that the Pope was dealing with a anti-religious government, would not allow children to pray in school, kept taking down crosses, a number of things you might identify in the current courts and in the current American elite. It's also clear from the film, and one of the most important parts of the film is the number of Poles who said, when we all came together, for example, 3 million people in Victory Square in Warsaw, and we looked around, we suddenly realized there are more of us than there are of the government. And I think if the American people would understand Pope John Paul II's message, be not afraid, that if you are prepared to shelter under the cross, if you allow Christ to protect you, there's nothing the government can do to you. And so you don't have to be afraid. And then stand up for religious liberty, because as the Pope says so clearly, without religious liberty, you cannot find yourself. And therefore you have no real freedoms.
Yeah, that message of human dignity so shines through, that we have that inherent dignity, and it isn't bestowed by the government. It comes from God, and that's really that was the constant message he was pounding in as he made his travels here. Now, Callista, you are Polish, your background.
Yes.
How did that influence your affiliation with this project and desire to be a part of this?
I've always admired the Holy Father, John Paul II. My father's family comes from Poland, just outside of Krakow. So I grew up as a Polish Catholic, and we practiced the traditions, the Polish traditions, and we've always been active in our church. And, through this, I've come to know and love Pope John Paul II. And for me, this was a very personal project.
Yeah. Now, did someone come to you all with this project, or did this come from you all?
Well, I think Vince Haley had the idea for a decade, and we'd had a great working relationship with David Bossie and Citizens United, and with Kevin Knobloch, who's our director. And so after we had done the Reagan film, I think when we saw the interviews on tape or on film, and we realized what Havel and what Wałęsa had said, and how much it fit into what Haley had told us they'd say. Right. And then we read Weigel's The Final Revolution, the book about the church in Eastern Europe. I think Callista and I just came to the conclusion that this was our destiny, that we had to do this.
Now, tell me about that moment. My producer was saying you told him, or he came across some information where you all were in Rome, and that sort of cemented the idea for you that you had to do this film.
Well,
was that during that visit?
There's a very funny moment where we have an opportunity to interview a priest who's very, very close to the Pope. And I can't identify much more than that for right now, but he is in the film. And we went with trepidation to see him. And we got there about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd walked our way through a variety of Vatican rooms with Swiss guards, and it was a little bit like a movie scene. And he was standing in the doorway, and it really had been built up to us as a very formidable guy. And he was standing in the doorway smiling, and he said, a friend just came by with some Slovenian wine. And why don't we sit down and chat for a little bit? It's 5 o'clock. We could, and you could tell for that moment, and Vince was with us, and the four of us sat there. And an hour and a half later, I just kind of felt like this was our destiny. We had to do this film. He so vividly explained why Pope John Paul II made such a huge difference in the world that you felt like you wanted to share that with as many people as you could.
And is that your intention here, to share this? Is there a deeper intention for this film? What do you want people to come away and say?
Yeah, we really want to share the inspiring story of John Paul II and his very important message of freedom through faith. And that comes through in this story of human liberation.
And this has been a central theme for you all in your last few projects. I mean, you have the Rediscovering God in America project. Yes. You've got, you had the book, and there are two DVDs,
two DVDs
correct?
on religious liberty in America.
So, I mean, this seems a recent passion of yours.
It was really inspired by the Ninth Circuit Court when they made the ruling about 7 years ago that saying one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance was unconstitutional. And for me, that was as big a moment as for Lincoln the Dred Scott decision, because I decided that if we were really going to allow the elites to destroy American core values, and remember, and Callista and I collaborated on this book and on all three of the movies, but our Declaration of Independence says we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, that either has meaning, in which case you and Callista and I are all three sovereign. Our power comes from God to us. It is inalienable, according to the Declaration of Independence. And therefore, we loan power to the government. The government doesn't loan power to us. Now, either that's true, and what I was struck with, partly by reading George Weigel, and then the more we learned about the Pope, because he'd lived under the Nazis and he lived under the Soviets, Pope John Paul II understood and said with enormous clarity, you cannot be a complete person unless you can approach Christ. That your religious sense is the highest human sense. And therefore, a state which blocks you from the religious part of your personality is a state which has deprived you of your most fundamental human right.
That's right. And Pope John Paul II really reminded the Polish people of their rich cultural heritage, and he recommitted them to the Catholic Church. And in doing so, he gave them the courage to stand up to the Soviet dictatorship.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And when you watch this, it reminds you again not only of his great intellectual strength, but the vibrancy of his person and the charisma he had. And even 5 years, it's only been 5 years since he left the papacy, but it seems like a lifetime. And seeing it again for me was very not only nostalgic, but it really drove home the importance of this man, the historical importance. Did it change your perception of him? Because you had met him as speaker.
Yeah, but
working on this
project.
project.
Fairness, it was very brief. I mean, I don't have the kind of experience you've had, and I certainly don't have the kind of experience George Weigel's had.
Oh, yeah.
I think what comes through, and you see this as much in the Nazi and Soviet periods as you do in the period when he's Pope. This is a person of such deep faith that he is fully prepared to die to be who he is. Now, it starts, when he helps form the Rhapsodic Theater under the Nazis, which had a death penalty.
Right.
Then he becomes a student priest under the Nazis, which had a death penalty. Then he takes on the Soviets routinely, regularly, every day. And you realize, and yet he wasn't combative. He wasn't hostile. He was a very cheerful representative of his faith.
We all remember that Stalin famously asked at some point during the Second World War, how many divisions has the Pope? Well, he got his answer in June '79, more than Stalin could imagine. Many more divisions than Stalin could imagine.
Perhaps at no time in the 20th century had one man so influenced the nation. It sparked a great movement of human liberation throughout Eastern Europe.
A revolution of conscience that confronted the lies of Marxism and Leninism. It led to the freedom of millions.
Many contributed to the defeat of Soviet communism, but it was Pope John Paul II who arguably had the greatest impact.
John Paul II, in a singular way, embodied the human triumphs, tragedies, adventures of the second half of the 20th century, as no one else did.
A man who stood for peace, a man who preached against war, a man who preached for individual freedom.
And his message was not just to the Poles, but to the other people repressed by the communist, atheist regime, that you too should have hope, and you too should have the strength of your faith, and you too have possibilities to become free.
When we come back, we're going to talk about Newt's conversion and Callista's influence on him, I think for the better. And we'll talk more about the film 9 Days That Changed the World. The World of Our Life continues in a moment. Stay right there. Well,
Once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. We're joined once again by Newt and Callista Gingrich. They are the executive producers of the new film 9 Days That Changed the World. It focuses on John Paul II's incredible influence on his homeland in Poland and what happened subsequently. Really turned history. And an incredible man, and you all are incredible people. Thanks for being with us. I want to talk about your conversion, Newt, which many people didn't see coming. It sort of appeared one day in the New York Times. Now, our cameramen at EWTN had been watching you trek into the Basilica not far from where we're shooting because your lovely wife is a member of the choir there.
Yes.
Now, I'd read that wherever you traveled, before Newt converted, you would take him to Mass with you.
Yes. We've been married since 2000. And although I do sing at the Basilica, occasionally we do travel. So whenever we're on the road, I'd always make sure that there was a Mass that we could go to. And so Newt has been going to church with me for many years.
Mm-hmm. And what influence did that have on the conversion? Was it a slow, progressive thing?
Well, let me say, first of all, we have heard Amazing Grace in Chinese. We've heard it in Hosa in South Africa. Wow. Callista's very, very faithful. And that was certainly an impact just by being with her all the time. I think what happened was that the process of going to the Basilica every Sunday, experiencing the Mass. I mean, the Basilica is such a beautiful place, and the music is so beautiful, and it's everybody there, Monsignor Rossi and everybody there does such a wonderful job. And there were two real break points. The first was the choir went to Rome to make a CD in honor of Pope John Paul II towards the very end of his life. I guess in March, he was already at the hospital. And they sang outside his room at the hospital. And it was the first time I can remember where I actually just had time off. I went as a spouse. And so they were recording at Centre Maggiore, and they could only record at night after the tourists left. Oh, wow. And so we'd get up in the morning, we were on a pilgrimage, and we would go to Mass, and we'd go to some interesting place, have a really nice Italian lunch, and then they would go off to record, and I was free. And I can't remember the last time that I had an entire week like this. And Monsignor Rossi was occasionally free, and he was sort of our leader and chaperone. And so we would sit and talk, and we talked about Weigel's cube in the cathedral, and we talked about the secular threat in Europe and the whole process of where Christianity was. And that really began my fundamental thinking at a historic level about the crisis of our civilization, the degree to which it relates directly to Christianity, and that you can't really explain the West without Christianity.
Right.
And so over the following several years, we kept talking about it and thinking about it. And then when Pope Benedict came to America, the choir was invited to sing when the Pope and the bishops had Vespers at the Basilica in the Crypt Church. And again, I was allowed as a spouse to show up. And seeing Pope Benedict come into the Basilica and seeing him, from 10 or 15 feet away, but seeing the joy in his eyes and the fact that he had chosen Christ our hope as the core of what he was trying to say to America. That night we were invited by Monsignor Rossi, who had quite a day, to come to dinner, and I said to him, I want to be received into the church. And we chatted briefly, and I said, I want you and Callista to be my sponsors, and I want you to take me through the catechism. And so we spent about 8 months going through the catechism together, and it was a very, very meaningful moment. And I came to the Basilica on a Sunday afternoon with 2,500 other people just before Easter, and Archbishop Worrell was very gracious, and it was really quite impressive.
Were there any hesitations? I mean, you were a Southern Baptist. You know the prejudices people hold toward the Catholic Church.
My background was very complicated. My grandmother actually originally raised me as a Missouri Synod Lutheran. I actually sang when I was very, very, unlike Callista, I quit. She actually sings, I don't sing. But when I was very, very young, I sang in the Lutheran choir. Then my dad was in the Army, and so I was an acolyte for whatever Protestant chaplain. So I've been a Presbyterian acolyte, I've been with Methodist. And then ultimately, once we moved to Georgia, and I became a Baptist. But my background is primarily one of deep belief in God. My grandmother really successfully drilled into me that there is a heaven and a hell, that if you're clever, you'll pick heaven. and that she would be glad to communicate to me in vivid ways what hell would be like if I didn't get it. And so I think I came out of that with a yearning. And the two things, I guess, that were the most powerful for me were, I have a sense of being at peace. I understand when you give the sign of peace and when the priest says, peace be with you, in a way I never did 10 or 15 years ago. I have a deep personal sense of what that means. And I find that the Eucharist is so fulfilling. I mean, for 9 years I watched Callista go and
you couldn't, you
have
didn't.
the Eucharist and have communion, and I didn't. And I knew what it meant to her. Obviously, I'd had communion in a Protestant setting, but there are some significant underlying differences theologically. And I really I find every Sunday that it is enormously meaningful to be allowed to participate in the body and blood of Christ and to actually experience the infusion and the full sense of the Eucharist.
Callista, have you noticed a change since the conversion in Newt?
Sure. I think you have a sense of peace that you didn't have a year ago.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's really been a great joy to be able to share in the sacraments together.
Yeah. And how long have you been at the choir, singing in the choir here at the Basilica?
Yes, I joined in October of 1996.
Wow, so you've been there a long time.
I'm one of the more senior people in the choir now.
Well, you
We
don't
like
look
to
it,
think
so.
we like to think that she was the first Brownie member of the
That's
choir.
right.
It's now enough years we don't particularly.
That's right. That's right. No need to recount all of that. Now, there are people, Newton, in this political town, people have opined in some of the blogs and elsewhere that this was a political decision on your part. How do you respond to that? That the conversion was somehow political?
I think that is, people that cynical can't be answered. I mean, there's nothing I can say to them about it.
Yeah.
What we did, and I think the hours that I spent with Monsignor Rossi, the conversation we still spend. I mean, the reading I am doing, and I did do.
Ellen, all those Sundays with your wife and the Mass. I mean, this wasn't a quickie.
Yeah.
This wasn't a quickie conversion.
I would just say, after 10 years of going to Mass everywhere in the world, this was hardly one of those shallow political gimmicks. I mean, we have spent a lot of hours, and obviously, given her schedule at the Basilica, we spend at Easter and at Christmas very long periods where the Basilica is at the center of our life. And I was doing that, frankly, as a supportive husband, and it sort of caught up with me in a way that I could never quite have imagined.
And being a historian, I'm sure that had some influence when you see the history of the Church and when you can see it and touch it in places like Rome.
Yeah, I mean, I do think from that standpoint that as somebody who loves history and thinks about history and writes books about history, the depth of a 2,000-year institution. When we're at St. Peter's and we went down into the Scavi and you standing there, and Callista and I had this wonderful experience of, standing where technically people are reasonably certain St. Peter is buried.
Yeah.
And you look at that and you think, there is a connectivity that crosses 2,000 years to the man who personally was with Christ.
Yeah.
Now, part of it, and I think it's part of what makes Christianity interesting, is that Christianity is either a historic religion or it has no meaning. And as a historian, I find it comforting to relax and say this is an act of faith, but it's an act of faith about which we know an amazing amount.
Yeah. How has, Callista, how has Newt's political eyes, if you will, changed since this conversion? Has there been
That's
a
a
change
good one.
in the way he approaches these issues?
I want to see where she goes with this.
I think Newt has espoused very consistent political philosophy since he first became a member of Congress. And, I think he is a very sensitive person, and I think perhaps in the last year has become more sensitive and perhaps even more emotional in the past year. But his political philosophy has been pretty consistent. If you look at speeches he gave in the 80s and the 90s, and you look at what he's saying today, he is a consistent person.
Yeah. Well, okay, what's your take on it?
Well, I think what she said was right. I think it goes back to what I said earlier about being at peace. Monsignor Rossi was a big part of this, and he and Archbishop Worrell have both done such a wonderful job of making us feel that, as people say to me occasionally, welcome home. Mm-hmm. And I think I understand why, as we say in the movie, the Pope holds on to the cross. The last scene we ever see of him is holding on to the cross from behind. And I think that part of what has happened for me that is different is that I feel I can shelter within the church and within the body of Christ in a way that I had never known before. And I think Callista's right. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think it does make me more emotional and more vulnerable because I don't have to be self-protecting because I have Christ and I have the church, and therefore I am protected.
Oh, fascinating. The movie is 9 Days That Changed the World. I hope everybody gets a chance to see it. Now, you are premiering it in various cities, but it's available on DVD, correct?
Yes, and if people would like to learn more about the movie, they can go to 9daysthatchangedtheworld.com.
Fantastic. Callista and Newt Gingrich, thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Until next week, you can find updates and the occasional commentary by following me on Twitter at twitter.com/Raymond Arroyo or on my Facebook fan page. Those of you who follow me get not only previews of our shows, but additional material from our guests. And you can always find me at RaymondArroyo.com. And hey, the prayers and personal devotions of Mother Angelica and the entire Mother Angelica collection, including my biography of Mother, are available at bookstores everywhere and through the EWTN Religious Catalog. And remember, starting in September, the world over, will move to Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, live. Please adjust your schedules and your DVRs. We don't want you to miss any programs. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye now.